Hello there. Thank you very much for watching this video cast. My name is Charlie, and today I just want to look at the aspect of change management. I'm sure you have heard many times as we discuss within academic and even business circle, or just in general, when we say we should hope for the best and plan for the worst. I go over again. We should hope for the best and plan for the worst. And I just want to unpack this statement in light of operating our businesses, specifically as micro, small, and medium enterprises. Why do I say so? Because ever since the outbreak of the global pandemic that is COVID-19, you find that it is no longer business as usual. And as much as economies globally are beginning to ease up in terms of the lockdown measures and different sectors of the economy beginning to open and businesses opening to public, but you'd realize that business is opening amidst new rules altogether. For example, 2 meter or 1.5 meter or 1 meter social distance, depending on the particular economy. But I'm specifically interested in looking at the micro level, that business, each business per se, from one business to the other. How are you going to implement the necessary changes? In other words, what does the statement hope for the best, plan for the worst imply? To me, my understanding is that when we say hope for the best, we imply your proactive strategies in businesses. This is whereby everything is normal, the macro environment is normal. Of course, we do understand and agree that change is inevitable, change is permanent. But at the same time, there is that macro environment that to us presents a semblance of normality, and we are used to that kind of macro environmental factors. And it is during this macro environment that in most cases we take out some retreats, some strategic planning retreats, and we plan for the future of our micro, small, or medium enterprise businesses, to say, what do we strive to achieve at the end of the year, 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years? And as we plan, we are planning in a unique macro environment with some semblance of normality, in the sense that we are appreciating and understanding that kind of environment. And then we begin to focus what a year would look like, or what 3 years would look like, or 5 years would look like, and 10 years would look like. You can begin to see that the more I add years, the higher the uncertainty, and therefore the degree of risk also increases, because we are beginning to focus or plan with a higher level of uncertainty. But in as much as we'll be planning, what we'll be doing there is hoping for the best. So you find that there is, if you want to put it in terms of scenario planning, this is whereby we are sort of having lots of this optimism to say we think that things are really going to turn out the way that we believe. So there's lots of optimisms there. But also in strategic planning, there is need to also take the perspective of pessimism, okay? This is where you are now bringing in your worst case scenarios, where you now ask, what if this negative effect takes place? What if this adverse factor come into play? So many times when we brainstorm in terms of how best we can ring fence our market share, or how best we can develop new products, or how best we can take another leap in terms of our competitive advantage, we find that sometimes we tend not to want to think of these adverse effects. We tend not to want to think of what if this negative thing takes place, which is the worst case scenario. You know, in a brainstorming event, some call it the devil's advocate, okay? The devil's advocate, where you need within your team members some people who always raise these negative connotations or this negative perspective. Because if we don't have this devil's advocate, then what tends to happen is we will always approve strategies that are based on hoping for the best or the optimistic. And yet, you and I know very well that the macro environment is not only complex or sophisticated, but it is ever dynamic, and change is inevitable. If there is anything that is permanent in our marketing environment, it is change. And COVID-19 has just reminded us how change is inevitable. And therefore, this statement, hope for the best, plan for the worst, encourages us that whenever we do our strategic planning, whenever we do or we come up with our business plans, we should never forget to plan for the worst. It is always important to incorporate that component where you doubt your own business plans. You should poke holes into your own strategic plans. In as much as you will be bubbling with confidence, given, let us say, for example, an excellent annual performance, the just ended year where you posted healthy profits and where you are receiving very positive annual reviews or monthly or quarterly reviews from your marketing intelligence audits, or even from independent market watchers, and you are receiving 5-star performance, and therefore you are bubbling with confidence. The advice is, don't forget to plan for the worst. Don't forget to plan for those worst years, which can always come at any time. Like, for example, just envisage how, because of COVID-19, the whole business fraternity, we are now in full acceleration in terms of our change management. Now, you may be asking, how do I go about as far as managing change is concerned? Well, there are so many ways of managing change and so many models, okay? But I'm just going to go through common ways to address change. The first thing, the number one thing is, if you are operating your micro, small, and medium enterprise, the number one thing for you to be able to effectively manage change is to acknowledge that change is permanent. Otherwise, if you are in denial mode, then you find it very difficult to address change. So the first thing is to acknowledge that change is inevitable. Change is permanent. Change is there. It is always prevalent in your business environment or your macro environment. Why is it very important? The moment you acknowledge this, it encourages you, number two, to always scan your marketing environment. So because you acknowledge that change is inevitable, it leads you to always scan the macro environment. You are always on the lookout, you see, to collect data from the business environment so that you begin to identify those indicators for change. What is changing in terms of the market environment? What is changing in terms of my competitors? What is changing in terms of the performance of my product? What is changing in terms of the operation? What is changing in terms of the legal environment? What is changing in terms of the cultural environment? So, because you acknowledge that change is inevitable, you then begin to scan to identify these indicators of change, like I'm telling you. Therefore, because you have this processual ongoing scanning, then you are better placed than your competitors who may not be doing this daily. So compare a business that is always scanning for these indicators for change and a business that is not doing any scanning at all. So number one, acknowledge that change is inevitable. And number two, always scan for these indicators for change. So what then naturally leads you to is number three, where you pick now these indicators for change. And as you pick the indicators for change, it then tells you to begin to plan a strategy for change. In other words, the need for change. So number one, acknowledge. Number two, scan, and you pick up these indicators for change leading to need for change. In other words, these indicators for change will hit a certain peak or a trigger or a presenting issue peak or trigger level that will tell you there is need for change. We can no longer continue operating our business as usual. And therefore, it demands you to then come up with a strategy for change. In other words, you are now identifying what needs to be changed. Why should it be changed? And how can we come up with the change, or how can we enforce the desired change? So we are now looking at the current situation and the triggers for change and the kind of the gap in between and what does change entails to you. As you come up also with this strategy for change, what is also very important as you come up with this strategy for change is to identify the impedance for change. In other words, a resistance for change. It is a well-known fact in business and even in general life that people as human beings, we do not tend to embrace change. In other words, we tend to resist change. In other words, the moment we get used to a particular tradition or culture, we get comfortable and we build up confidence and we build silos and say, this is my comfort zone. And we tend not to want to get out of our comfort zone. And this is why we then usually tend to resist change. So in the business sector, micro, small, and medium enterprises, you then need to identify the potential resistance to change so that you then come up with strategies to deal with these impediments for change and resistance for change. So number four, you then need to implement the change. So number one, acknowledge change. And number two, always scan out the environment so that you can pick out the indicators for change and identify those trigger levels where you say, now is the time to introduce change. And three, come up with the strategy for change, which includes the step-by-step and the tactics of how you are going to implement the change, who is going to do what, when, where, why, and what sort of resistance for change are you identifying. And so once you have done that, number four is to implement the change. And part of implementing the change involves the key aspect of adequate communication. Don't just implement change without communicating adequately with all stakeholders, okay? It involves communicating to those who are in strategic authority to actually approve the change. In any case, you can't implement it if it has not been approved. So what it implements is, what it implies is that implementing change, you are implementing because it has been approved by those who have the authority to approve the change. And you also need to communicate even to the lower line staff, because if you simply come to them and say, right, this is what we are going to do starting on Monday, and without explaining to them so that they understand what does this change imply, why should there be a change, and how does it impact on their lives and how does it impact on their career. Otherwise, then you find that your staff will not be cooperative in implementing this change. So the implementation of change entails effective communication. And also during the implementation, it also entails issues to do with budgets. Otherwise, there is no change implementation that is going to be successful if you do not adequately resource the change. Okay, so you need adequate budget to resource it, so that there's the adequate budget from finance to other material requirements, so that this change will be successful. And then we move on to number 5, which will be monitoring. So during the implementation of the change, you need to constantly monitor. In other words, you are collecting data to establish whether you are getting the outputs that you are desiring from the change. Because obviously, when you say we need to change, it means you will have built in some performance verifiable indicators, which will tell you that yes, that change is happening. So you need to monitor it. And what it means is the moment you pick up negative indicators, then you need to stop, or then you need to address, so that you keep getting the positive indicators, which tells you that the change strategy is working according to plan. And finally, you need to evaluate the change at the end of it. It is important to evaluate at the end of the entire change program, so that you can learn from the whole process. There are always takeaway gains there and takeaway losses, to say we could have done this change program better, or we actually excelled in doing this change program better. And then it helps you to feed into future change programs. So there we are. Always hope for the best, but plan for the worst. So this is how you can go about administering change management in your business. In other words, acknowledge that change is inevitable and change is permanent. Number 2, always scan out the marketing environment to identify the indicators for change and their trigger levels. And number 3, come to identify that there's need for change. Therefore, craft the change management strategy, okay? Who does what, where, why, and how, and then implement the change, which includes obtaining the approval for change, communicating with all the stakeholders involved, including budgeting and resourcing. And then you go on to monitor, okay, the change as it is being implemented, so that is the change actually delivering the desired outcomes or not? And then you quickly rectify any other adverse outcomes. And finally, evaluating the total process change. That way it will help you. And coming back to that statement again, always hope for the best, but plan for the worst. It tells us that we need to be proactive in business. Let us not wait for pandemics such like COVID-19 to introduce change. You find that there are these sort of significant disasters that just come boom, and that tells us you must change whether you like it or not. This is different from a proactive way of planning for change and always infusing change. So you can imagine if you had proactively planned for change, it means that during normal times, you would have said, what if this thing happens? What if I just wake up one day and I could no longer deliver my product in the way that I'm delivering it, with the technology that I'm delivering it, in the manner that I'm delivering it? What else can I resort to? If you had thought of this, you find that you'll be better placed to actually move on or to transform from your previous tradition of delivering your products and service to the new change platform, because already you had this in mind and you had this on paper. But this is totally different from someone who had never dreamt that somehow, someday, they are just going to find themselves failing to deliver their products and services in the way that they have always done. So you find that it becomes a mammoth task because they are now being forced by this drastic, spectacular event such as COVID-19 to say it's no longer business as usual. You just have to change. I hope and trust that you have enjoyed this video cast. My name is Charlie, and I hold a PhD in management from Manchester Metropolitan University. And my interest and passion and expertise is in providing customized business advisory services to micro, small, and medium enterprises. And should you be interested that we carry this conversation further, discussing about change management and how you can actually do it in your own business, feel free to get in touch with me on sahwiramarketing@gmail.com. sahwiramarketing@gmail.com. Have a very good day and good luck in your change management strategies.